Okay, great. I think we're ready to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our guests tuning in here. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you're keeping well wherever you are. My name is Malika Talwar, and with my co-host Jen Shin, I'll be facilitating today's panel, COVID-19 and Climate Resilience, Exploring Interconnections and Lessons Learned to Build Back Better. We hope today's event will generate important discussions, reflections, and actions from the lessons we've learned in recent months during the pandemic. And now also the movement for Black lives that will direct climate and resilience work going forward. Before we get started, we'd like to thank Rachel Jacobson and Beth Gibbons at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals and Kevin Doyle here at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies for supporting this panel today.
We're really thrilled to have a stellar lineup of climate resilience experts from across the nation to help us create this dialogue today. First, we have Kara Pike, founder and director of Climate Access, a nonprofit focused on building political and public support for climate solutions through learning networks, pilot projects, communication research, and strategy consulting. She'll be joining us very shortly. Next, we have Kay Baja, Program Director of Climate Resilience at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, a nonprofit and member-driven organization that supports government practitioners in accelerating urban sustainability. Baja helps cities identify strategic ways to advance climate resilience planning and implementation and helps in building their capacity to take proactive action. Our next panelist is Deanna Moran, Director of Environmental Planning at Conservation Law Foundation, an advocacy organization working across New England and the Northeast Corridor. Deanna identifies and implements cutting-edge solutions to environmental problems lying at the intersection of planning, development, and regulation. And last but not least, we have Shalini Vajhala, founder and CEO of the interdisciplinary design and finance firm Refocus Partners, which focuses on bridging the gap between public and private sectors and catalyzing sustainable investment in cities around the world. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us. Rachel, if you're able to hear me, could you stop your screen share? And yeah, great, thanks. And we also just wanted to make a quick announcement for those of you joining us from home that we will have time at the end of the panel for questions. So if you have a question that arises during the discussion, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will be sure to give time for your question at the end of the panel. And Kevin, who's just come on, will be moderating that process. Okay, so let's get to it. We want to begin today by thinking about how, as states begin to reopen their economies, there is understandably a huge amount of concern for and energy directed toward pandemic recovery right now. As leaders in the resilience profession, what have you been working on, and what is currently on your radar for resilience work in the context of COVID? Shalini, why don't you help us kick things off today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, let me start by saying thank you to Jen and Malika for pulling together this great group. It's, I hear so often about manels and panels of all men, so this is like a real joy to speak with a group of women leaders in the resilience field. And thank you very much to the ASAP team for putting us all together as well. So I have interestingly found that much of our work has not actually changed. It's just taken on new urgency in the face of COVID and Black Lives Matter. And that's largely because, June 1st was the start of hurricane season. Hurricanes don't stop for pandemics, unfortunately. And so those of us who have been working on chronic risks all along and making structural systems work better are, I think, finding new attention and relevance to our work, but not necessarily seeing a huge difference in what we work on and how we do it, just a huge increase in the need for it and awareness of it. And so my team and I have continued to work on things like insurance solutions for aligning physical and financial risks. So think about coastal protection should reduce the cost of insurance, and it rarely does. And so how do you actually line those things up? We've also more recently been working with local governments that are seeking to explicitly pursue a green recovery. And so tackling things that have been pressing issues for a decade, like deferred maintenance of infrastructure, with new investments to try to jumpstart both workforce and reemployment priorities, and also fill holes that have been there a long time. And so I see this crisis as a continued opportunity to do more and better and fix so many of the structural issues, including structural racism, that have gotten us to where we are today.
Great, thank you. Deanna, did you want to add to that, or could you share some of your experience?
Absolutely. First, I just want to agree with Shalini. I think that is spot on, particularly around the fact that a lot of us have been working on these issues for a long time and the work doesn't really substantively change, just new opportunities arise to push it forward. And in that context, one of the things that has really been on my radar, as Shalini alluded to, was legislation. I think that there are opportunities right now and will be opportunities over the next year to really make the connections between COVID recovery and climate resilience, and to prioritize resilience funding in any stimulus or infrastructure bills that come out of the federal government. And, a lot of people have said this, but it really is a pivotal moment to build back better. As Shalini mentioned, the basis of a lot of these bills are deferred maintenance. So there's a huge opportunity here, not only to fix what we have, but to, go beyond the status quo and make things better. And pandemic-induced financial decisions, that are going to be made over the next 12 months could shape the global economy for a decade or more. So it's really unacceptable, I think, that we wouldn't factor resilience into these investments. And more importantly, when it comes to resilience, there are millions of jobs that we can create in the short term and the long term to both jumpstart the economy and cut carbon, cut air pollution. And we should be training people for those jobs. And there's a couple of bills in Congress right now that are seeking to do that, and I think would be opportunities to push this message. Most importantly, the one that was recently announced by the House, the Moving America Forward legislation, which combines transportation and infrastructure improvements with a number of other things that are important to this movement, including $1 billion for climate resiliency upgrades to public housing. I think it's also a really galvanizing moment for parks, open space, and conservation land. We've seen throughout the pandemic how important those spaces are for people seeking respite, especially people who don't have access to private outdoor space, which has a lot of equity implications. And those efforts have been underfunded for decades. And so Congress just recently announced the passage of an effort that will fully and permanently fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which funnels money into local, state, and national parks and other public lands across the country. And that annual earmark is now going to be $900 million. So that, coupled with the opportunities people are seeing around public space, I think is a huge opportunity in COVID recovery. And then finally, I'll just mention on the Fema funding side, FEMA's had a pre-disaster mitigation grant program for some time now, and that program has kind of recently been tweaked and rebranded to the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities Program, or BRIC. And a barrier to entry for a long time to that program is that it actually requires that your state have had a major disaster declaration in the last 7 years. And in some states that would like to be doing climate-related resilience projects, they don't meet that eligibility requirement. But with COVID, all 50 states and 4 territories have been approved for major disaster declarations, which opens them up to that funding opportunity and probably other opportunities that they haven't had before. So again, I think all of these legislation and funding opportunities provide us with a really critical platform to move the work forward.
Thank you both for helping us to understand the importance of the work that we have to do at the broader scale, especially in legislation and infrastructure. Baja, given your work with USDN, would you be able to share some of your experience working with both communities and local governments and municipalities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to echo both the thank you for bringing this amazing panel together, and also the statements that were already said, because I agree with all of them. Same with USDN. We actually haven't changed the way that we're doing our work significantly. we've always been grounded in racial equity and talking about white supremacy and acknowledging that racism is the water that we swim in. Similar to what Shalini said, is there's this new urgency for the work and a tweak in some ways to look at it differently. We're finding that folks are more about centering humans, as we've been saying, instead of the disruption, which has been sort of the way we've seen FEMA and others approaching resilience rather than thinking about it holistically. So I see this as a really big opportunity to actually reframe resilience instead of this archaic definition of bouncing back. The opportunity to say that resilience needs to be every day. We need to be focusing on human needs and connectivity and adaptive capacity and being proactive because of these sort of multi-hazard or multi-crisis situations as we're seeing with COVID. So that sort of reframing space certainly is something we've been talking about for a while, the grounding and centering in racism and acknowledging the connections between the fact that even the environmental movement is grounded in racism. So a lot of the work that sustainability directors are doing is that acknowledgement of our racist policies and practices, our sort of reactive approaches, and trying to switch that up to more proactive community-centered approaches. I will admit a lot of our members are dealing with budget cuts. And so that has been a big transition. Not so much that sustainability and climate change were heavily funded before, and certainly not racial equity work, but now it's potential positions being lost. The people who are leading this work in government, as Deanna said, we're seeing that there's just not enough funding for the things that people have been relying on: parks and open space, art programs, the number of people who turned to Netflix during this pandemic and art, but now we're cutting art programming. Same thing with sustainability and climate change. Those are the things that we're seeing as far as trends with the new budgeting sessions. And so we're really working on making the case for sustainability and resilience professionals, and the fact that they are leading a lot of this equity work within government and pressing on other departments to make changes, to think about systems-based approaches, and also to think about more multi-crisis or multi-hazard situations where we're not just focusing on one disruption, but acknowledging there are going to be pandemic plus hurricane or extreme heat event, or in many situations, all three. How are we addressing all of these together? So there's a lot of other work happening on sort of innovative engagement and outreach. That's been a really big space, especially with our technology gaps. Acknowledging that the traditional way that we would go through doing outreach and engagement with frontline communities and hard to reach communities would be going to and bringing together in large spaces. So bridging that gap, being more innovative, thinking about different solutions. Those are some of the things that USDN is working on right now collectively.
Thank you so much, Baja, for your insights. All of you have echoed that the work in the resilience space is not changing. It's just sort of reprioritizing and re-energizing the work we have. And you've all also highlighted the need for systems thinking. And that really segues, that really helps us move into our next question, which is, recently ASAP's executive director, Beth Gibbons, wrote that as resilience professionals, we're no strangers to the core competencies of resilience: flexibility, systems thinking, communication, and pursuit of transformative change. Climate adaptation and resilience work has, for many decades, dealt with the same challenges that have currently been heightened due to the pandemic. This includes impacts on food supply chains, economies, livelihoods, and particularly the underlying issues of racial justice and equity. There are many valuable lessons that we can learn from the resilience space and transfer to pandemic recovery. What is one climate resilience project that you've been involved with that can give us clues about pandemic recovery? Deanna, given your experience working on policy and legislation and more broadly thinking at a systems level, would you like to share some of your thoughts on this?
Sure. I'm going to throw a curveball. I was actually going to talk about a specific project. But, I think that what Beth said is really true. And when I was thinking about this question ahead of time, it really occurred to me that a lot of the same philosophies that we approach climate resilience work are applicable in a lot of different spaces, this being one of them. And one of the, the foundation for a lot of our work is this idea of co-benefits, and this idea that climate resilience is really, it is the foundation of a lot of other, positive externalities, that it really isn't siloed. It's not something that happens in a vacuum. And one project that, I had recently worked on that was really framed in a climate resilience lens, but it became very evident that there were all of these other important pieces, was we worked on an urban forest master plan project for a city in Massachusetts that was struggling with its urban canopy coverage. And they were really coming at it from a climate change lens, understanding that canopy is, an important tool for combating extreme heat and urban heat island effect. But in that process, in our data collection and in our surveys and in our research, it became obvious that not only did they have an urban canopy coverage problem, the canopy wasn't evenly distributed across the city either. And when we dug into that, we realized that many of the neighborhoods that had poor canopy coverage or had trees in poor condition were the same neighborhoods with a lot of people who are low income, people of color. And I'm sure a lot of people, at this event right now have seen all of the research and information that has come out over the past several years, a decade or more, about the relationship between redlining and some of these negative externalities that we now see in these communities, like canopy coverage. And so we really pivoted in that project to make sure that we were looking at it from a more holistic place. And I think that, my message there was, that's all resilience, because as Shalini mentioned, we can't become resilient until we start to address some of these underlying inequities, some of these issues in the structural systems that we're depending on. And it's never in a vacuum. So I think for me, that would be my takeaway into this next phase is the work is the same, but we need to acknowledge that co-benefits is a huge part of what we're doing. And we can never ultimately achieve our goals of resilience unless we're thinking about it more holistically and we're understanding that these structural inequities feed into everything that we're trying to do, and we'll never be successful unless we can address them.
Thank you. Baja, would you like to build off of that and add to that?
Yeah, thank you. I think fairly similarly, it's hard to pick just one right now, because I think so much of what we're doing is moving the work into working at an intersection space, or at what we're calling the nexus of grounding everything in racial equity, grounding in the acknowledgement of white supremacy, and then building at the intersection of resilience and greenhouse gas mitigation. But making sure that everything that we're doing is not just around a plan or a project. We're actually focusing a lot on the individuals and training individuals to understand their place in the space and also the power that they hold. We're doing a lot of education on power and then how to shift power, both internally and then within a project and a plan, within a code and a policy, but then also trying to work on the next layer, we call it the onion, of cultural shift within government, which is not something that's going to happen this summer. This is a process. It takes a long time, but that's what we're pushing for. Is you have to have the individuals and the individual awareness, then building into the work that we're doing, building into the culture, and then hopefully getting to transformation. So really focusing on acknowledgement of power, understanding of power, understanding of dynamics and why power is the way it is, especially in communities and neighborhoods, and with frontline communities and communities of color. And then how we're actually actively shifting power throughout the entire process, not just in one plan or one project or one phase. So we're creating essentially our Nexus project that's the basis for the majority of all of our other resilience work, to acknowledge that we need to be doing power shifting throughout the entire process, power sharing, stepping back, and acknowledging that things have to shift significantly. As far as where that falls in, outside of this conceptual changing of the bigger sort of process, we are integrating it into the way we're looking at funding of resilience projects, the intersectionality and doing more at the sort of social benefits. And then also, I've talked a lot about community resilience hubs, but it does bring together a lot of our sectors and systems and does have that power shifting component of being centered in neighborhoods and run by members of the community or the community-based organizations. So that's a specific project that's building off of what we're looking to do with the process and the content.
Thank you. Shalini, would you like to jump in and speak specifically to some of the work you've been doing?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here nodding like some sort of bobblehead because I'm agreeing with so much of what Deanna and Bajai are saying. I'm going to give a very specific project example that actually precedes before the work we were doing was actually called Resilience. Just to try to anchor us in the fact that we can do a lot of this, and a lot of it isn't called resilience, but it creates resilience. So in my former life at EPA, I helped lead the international and tribal affairs programs, and we were dreadfully underfunded and overstretched. And so I got pretty effective at spending other people's money, which is what led to founding Refocus. But in that, in the time that I was at EPA, I had a chance to work with some amazing lawyers who had been working for almost a decade on issues at tribal schools. And the issues that hit EPA were water quality issues, lead, asbestos, and it was a nationwide problem. Almost every single tribal school in the Bureau of Indian Education was not complying with environmental standards, really essential ones that were affecting generations of students. And I got a remarkable education from some tremendous career staff at EPA who explained to me that there is a system where federal agencies can take action against other federal agencies. And so EPA for 10 years had been pushing on the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to fix these tribal schools. And it resembled an intra-governmental lawsuit that they were involved in to repair these schools and correct the environmental harms. And when I came into the project, it was at a fascinating moment because it was stuck. And so because I had no idea really how the process unfolded, I was able to ask questions that kind of cracked us open. And so one of the things was, well, do they just have to fix it by putting money into it? Can they do something else? And EPA has a little known program called a Supplemental Environmental Project Program, which is in response to, Deanna's nodding, so I'm not getting this wrong several years later, that's good. But the SEP program is one that allows a corrective action to actually be in the form of a project, as opposed to a financial payment or a fine, which is fantastic because if the tribal schools had, the problem had been corrected by just transferring money from one pot to another, those kids wouldn't have seen an outcome on the ground and very quickly at any rate. And so what we did is we constructed this SEP to help address water quality violations by putting in solar power, because the reason that the water was bad is because the power kept going out. And so we just zoomed out a little bit to track the problem to its ultimate source. And so one of the things I was most proud of in my time at EPA was something that I can only take a fraction of credit for because people had been working at it for a decade. But the Havasupai were able to build a solar system on their reservation, which for anyone who's been to Supai, it's incredibly remote. And they're now dealing with a much, much better situation at their tribal school. Nobody labeled this project resilience. It was probably about 5 years before the term even came into vogue. And it is absolutely fundamental to how we work now, which is look at who loses money and how to make them look good and fix a structural problem so that you're not just solving for one thing, you're solving for many. And Deanna, I usually break into hives when I hear the term co-benefits because it's so often used to cover up a lack of analysis rather than an actual motivating force to drive action on and create multiple benefits. So examples like that one where you can, use parking fees to pay for flooding mitigation, where you can solve a power and a water problem are what really drives our work at a micro level and at a macro level.
Great. Thank you all for setting the tone of this conversation so far, and for sharing these important insights. We're now going to shift gears a little bit towards reflection more, both about how the connections between the current movement for Black lives and resilience work more broadly, which we've already begun to do here. And so in many ways, this pandemic has further highlighted the systemic weaknesses within our governments, economies, culture, and institutions. And more recently, the national global movement and demand for social justice has shed a critical light on the deeply ingrained and intrinsic inequalities that plague our systems. We've established here already that Black and brown folks have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, just as they are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so as we reflect and learn from this historic time, how do you see your work being directed or changed in climate adaptation and resilience? Baja, I know you already mentioned earlier that your work has previously already been centered in racial equity, but would you like to elaborate a little bit further about your work with resilience hubs and power shifting, and how you see this work advancing or evolving or gaining even more momentum at this time?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always make sure to do is acknowledge that I'm a white person with white skin, and I have a lot of privilege in this space. And I pretty much acknowledge that in any room at this point, because I've been doing this work for a while. I think it takes people some time to get to that point, but I would encourage everyone who does live in a white body, who is not dealing with the inequities around your skin color, to be acknowledging of that when you walk into any space, whether virtual or in person. Also, I think a lot of, I break this into sort of personal and professional, because I think the work needs to happen all around. Personally, over the last 2 years, I have been having randomly PowerPoint presentations on the side of the wall by my house, and having people come to learn about racial equity and their own power and privilege in the space. It's mostly people that I spend my extracurricular time with, so a lot of mountain bikers and climbers who don't think about this work a lot. But I think it's been really critical and important, and has kind of come back now. As it was mentioned, now there's this new urgency for the work. All of a sudden people are, what should I read? I remember this presentation. What should I be doing? Help me out at work, these kind of things. So I think there's a lot of my own work that needs to continue, of personally sitting in the space and reflecting on my own privilege and the privilege I have from my family, how that plays into my interactions and the work I do, the times I need to step back, and also the times I need to step forward and to use my voice in a proactive way. So there's that personal space. I think a lot of educating folks on qualified immunity, police unions, other things that I'm heavily aware of, that maybe this is not people's lived reality of what they're doing every single day, is dealing with government as a broken system. So this integrates into then the professional space of acknowledging that government and institutions are completely broken systems. The entire Constitution is based on white supremacy, white male landowners, and the taking of land from the tribe that were here before us. So acknowledging that runs deep and heavy, that there's a lot of corrective action that needs to be taken, and supporting that corrective action in every phase and every action. And if folks on the call haven't heard of a targeted universalism approach from the Haas Institute in Berkeley, I would highly recommend looking it up. We're looking at that approach to acknowledge that, yes, all people's needs matter, all lives are important, but we need to be prioritizing our resources, our funding, and our action in the disenfranchised communities that have been held down for decades based on our racist policies and practices. The Resilience Hub work is intended to be centered in neighborhoods and with community members identifying their everyday needs and services that they need to just get through right now, because again, we've had so many inequities, and now that's caused food deserts is the typical thing. I think in Baltimore we call it food apartheid, but acknowledging that there's a lot of inequities in just access to transportation, and to food, and to healthy and clean water, and to education. So making sure that we are centering in trusted community spaces that are managed and run by trusted folks, not usually government in any way, and that they're meeting 5 different sort of what we call resilient categories, which are resilient services and programming, resilient operations, resilient communications, the building itself and the landscape around it, and then the power systems. And having the community members identify what the needs are in all 5 of those spaces, and then actually providing the funding, and again, shifting of that power in both the management, but also in the way that resources come into the space and are being managed in the space. And we call it different phases of resilience, but in that everyday sort of resilience, and then in event of a disruption and in recovery. And it does work in pandemic space as well, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to stop.
Oh, that's really great, Baja. Thank you. Shalini, in previous conversations that we've had, you've mentioned the beauty actually of working at the seams, and your example of addressing water quality by putting in solar panels or solar power, I think is an example of getting to the root of these systemic problems that we're talking about that are plaguing our systems, and relates, I think, in many ways to what Baja just mentioned about the targeted universal approach. Do you have additional thoughts that you'd like to share about how your work might be directed moving forward?
Yeah, I think I had a fantastic definition of resilience that I'd never heard before in about 10 years in the field show up on my desk a couple days ago. And it's actually out of an organization called Dignity and Power Now that works on issues of incarceration and justice. And their definition, I'm going to read this for everyone because I think it is so on point. It says, the purpose of resilience is not to build the capacity to endure more harm. We build resilience to be more skillful in confronting the systems that have harmed us. And I had to sit down. I was like, wow, I've been at this for a very long time. I have been in some absolutely painful rooms talking about the definition of resilience and kind of missing the point on what it means for people on the ground. And so I thought this was absolutely the crux of what we all need to be doing. Don't just try to make everyone more sturdy. Fix the thing that requires them to be sturdy or exceptional in the first place. And one thing that I have found tremendously freeing in our work, especially working in finance, is that we have to spend a lot of time doing an end run about the issues that get us to really reach the most vulnerable. So to explain that, if this industry is hit by a hurricane, it leads to explosions that affect the workers who are the most vulnerable. And so you need to protect that thing or make roads more accessible so workers can get to work. And so I have to do far fewer of those long convoluted explanations on why you should make this investment. And it has been wonderful. I think the transformational thing I'd really like to see are whole industries like insurance that are way better at protecting assets than people and valuing assets than people and social networks. And that's a decade of work. That's, I don't remember if it's Deanna or Baja that mentioned it, but this is not going to happen this summer, right? We are not going to change government institutions and the insurance industry this summer, but we are going to start, damn it. So I'll stop there.
I'm seeing some comments in the chat asking for you to repeat the organization that came up.
Oh, yeah. Happy to. So it's an organization called Dignity and Power Now. And they are Los Angeles based and fight for incarcerated people's rights. And I'll repeat the definition also because it's that good. It's the purpose of resilience is not to build the capacity to endure more harm. We build resilience to be more skillful in confronting the systems that have harmed us.
Ooh, I tried to type it out for the group, but I missed it. So someone else hopefully can.
I'll paste it into the chat.
Can put it in there. And I guess to wrap up this third question here, Deanna, did you want to include any of your thoughts about how your work will be directed moving forward?
Yeah, I think, I have a couple of thoughts here. I think one thing that I've thought a lot about in the past few months is people have called COVID-19 a fire drill for the climate crisis, which I think is kind of a gross oversimplification of it. But it has exposed and amplified the structural inequities that we've been talking about, the inefficiencies and underlying systems, social, environmental, economic, health. there's an acknowledgement that these are all the same systems that are going to be exacerbated by climate change, hence the fire drill analogy. And the same populations that have been hit hard by COVID are likely to be the ones that will be most affected by climate impacts. And I think that the positive of those connections, people making those connections, is that it makes it harder for adaptation professionals to compartmentalize the environmental aspects of climate resilience and adaptation and the social justice aspects of it. And I think it's really fantastic that, all the panelists here, their work is already rooted in equity, and it is centered in equity, and those are things that they have been thinking about for a long time. I think if we're being honest, we can say that that is not true for the field generally, and that there are still people who have a lot of learning to do, and people who still see climate justice as a subcategory of climate resilience. And so I'm hoping that this is an opportunity to kind of change that, and to go back to what Baja was saying, like, there are people who are eager for these resources now, and that's a great thing. And I want to encourage that learning, but maybe this is the moment where we can kind of change that. I think the other thing that I've thought a lot about, and I think that I'm guilty of, is when we look at some of the strategies that we've, reactively deployed in the face of the pandemic, things like reclaiming streets and parking lots for outdoor space, shifting people to remote work. We've kind of held up all of these strategies as best practices and solutions, and the environmental community has said, look how great this has been. We've seen reduction in carbon emissions, and we can shift away from single occupancy vehicles, and we are more flexible as a society than we thought we were. And all of those things are true and they're good, but I think that we have to acknowledge where we've fallen short. And even in this moment, there are a lot of people who have been left behind. And I think that the most glaring of those examples are, one, that somewhat of a disregard for frontline workers, people who are not white collar, people who are hourly workers, people who don't have the flexibility to work remote or to work off peak hours or to take time off. They've been left out, I think, of our solutions. And then the other one that's really glaring to me is the disregard of, decades to a century of criminalization of public space for Black and brown people. And there is this assumption that, look how great this is, that people are accessing parks and open spaces, and they have this alternative when they don't have private outdoor spaces, and we should fund these spaces, and they're such a great solution. But not everybody, there hasn't been that acknowledgement that not everybody has equal access to those spaces. Not everyone feels comfortable or welcomed in those spaces. And in many cases, people are fearful or are actually in danger in those spaces. And so it's not a solution in and of itself. It is part of a solution, and we need to take it a step further. And so for me, what that signals, and again, I'll say, like, I have been guilty of this because I hold up some of those best practices, and it took me a second to say, actually, this isn't serving everyone the way that it should. And I think that what we should be focusing on there is that at the end of the day, people of color are often not at the table helping to design these solutions or make these decisions, and their knowledge and their lived experiences are left out. And that is a huge loss. That's knowledge that we're leaving on the table that's making our solutions less effective. So I hope that this is a learning moment, and when we can take a step back and we can pause and say, okay, and in a moment of crisis, what was our response? How did our response fail people? And how do we change that going forward? Not only in the emergency response context, but more generally when we're crafting, design solutions, policy solutions, whatever it may be. And I think that there is going to be that moment of learning, and I hope that everyone will come to that from a genuine place and have an intentional and thoughtful conversation about that.
Thank you so much, all of you, for all your honest reflections. We think that perhaps now more than ever, it is important for each of us to be reflective, not only individually, but also as a sector and as a community. And so we really thank you for these candid reflections. And that brings us to our last question. All of you have highlighted the need for systems change. And, we will be needing systemic change to take resilience work forward post-COVID with integrity and humility and thoughtfulness. I imagine that this would mean sort of broadening our horizons, right? And like looking at what are some new partnerships and new resources that we can bring in and to help take this work forward. Shalini, you've spoken about getting to the roots of problems, and you've also spoken about the insurance industry in particular and the systemic reforms it needs. What are some new partnerships and resources that you think would be required to bring about that systemic change?
It's I love the question. Our bread and butter is partnerships. We put together really strange bedfellows to deliver infrastructure and resilience solutions to communities that wouldn't otherwise have them. And so our metrics of success are really, is a shovel in the ground to make a real change in a community? And has it reached the people we want? Or have we moved money to a problem that's under-resourced? And I think with that in mind, I actually want to go to the micro level on these new resources and partnerships. And I think it's going to be very tempting in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, to try to diversify the conversation and bring people to the table. And for any organization that is hiring or trying to address these issues, I would actually have a direct call to action, which is, please don't just hire one. Don't create that poor person who has to speak for an entire field, an entire group, an entire fill in the blank. And as the only women and minority very often in a lot of civil engineering and finance discussions, I always find it tremendously heartening when there is another voice. And so it doesn't all come back to you. And so I would encourage everyone not just to think about partnerships at the big organizational levels, but think about who you bring to the tables you're at that only have the one. And how you think about, I had someone challenge the idea of diversity in general, which is diverse from what, right? So look at your baseline and figure out what you're trying to diversify from. And then give that diversification enough heft that it sticks. And I think that's true whether you're looking at adding women to boards, adding minorities to community leadership positions in big decisions, like what happens to big transit systems. And so we will continue our partnership work with big industries and with government agencies and international organizations. But we're also going to push really hard with our voices to try to bring others to the decision tables that don't look like everybody that's already there.
Thank you. Deanna, I would love to hear your thoughts, but before that, I just want to be mindful of time. We're running slightly behind schedule, and we do want to have time for all of the amazing questions that are coming in. So just a reminder for brief thoughts on what new partnerships and new resources we'll need to take this work forward.
Yeah, I don't have much to add beyond that. I would just echo everything that's been said. And I think that especially when it comes to new resources, I think something that has struck me is in a moment like this where people are kind of coming to the realization that there are these challenges that they haven't really engaged in before, there is the tendency to think of it as kind of in the white savior complex of like, oh, this is like a new issue that requires new scholarship and new practices, and we need to figure this out. And, I really challenged myself on that because it's not, because there are a lot of people who have been thinking about this. We just haven't given them the opportunity to share their ideas. And I think that, making that space, but also seeking out the resources that do exist, that have not been elevated as much as other resources is a very simple thing that we can all do. And I'll just share as an anecdote, one of the articles that I read recently was from Project for Public Spaces. They had recently, it was based on a panel that they hosted recently about equitable development post-COVID. And there were a lot of really concrete ideas for moving forward, and an idea that kind of really resonated with me, a challenge that resonated with me that they had pointed out was that, you know, in the midst of the pandemic and in the recovery period after it, it's very likely that public spaces will become one of, if not our most valuable asset. We're already starting to see that, right, with, you know, outdoor expansion of outdoor dining and people kind of snatching up public space because they can't have as many people indoors. And the question that, you know, was kind of posed in the article is, how do we make sure that everyone benefits in that moment where there may be the kind of this value capture moment, and to make sure that it's not done in a predatory way and that we aren't unjustly privatizing or commoditizing public spaces to the detriment of others. So that's something that I personally am going to take into my work. I do a lot of work with public spaces and parks, and I want to think really critically about that. But I think, you know, those resources are out there, and I think it's just a matter of seeking them out. I think that's an easy thing for us all to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana. Baja, you mentioned your work with resilience hubs, and you said those are centered in communities. So I feel like this would be very relevant to your work, you know, reaching out and building partnerships and finding the resources that you need to take that forward. So would really love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would love to answer that. And also, I do think there's something even bigger and better. And that is, I want to echo what both of the other speakers have said and say, yes, agree. But I think there's a huge piece of mental health and trauma that we don't bring into resilience that needs to be a core foundational component. And when we talk about new partnerships or new ways, it's not new, it's just that we've rejected it for so long because it's hard, it's uncomfortable, and it's where we need to actually focus time and attention. People feel that mental health is something that, you know, makes you sick or crazy or all these other words that are awful. And in fact, we need to just go back to treating people like humans. So much of the work we do is dehumanizing. So we all have needs. We all have flaws and beauty and stories. And I think we need to stop the dehumanizing approaches and really center on trauma and the fact that so many folks have experienced trauma for decades or entire lives that needs to be repaired or considered or part of the approach, and then bringing that mental health access into everything we're doing around resilience. That can happen through resilience hubs. I would happily say that that's something that can happen and should happen at a very neighborhood level where there's a lot of trust and a lot of collective action that can be taken around trauma and going through it. But that's a huge piece, I think, of new partnerships. And I think this getting out of the extractive process and the sort of transactional approach, we need to stop saying we're engaging with people for this process, or as it was mentioned, the one person who represents an entire community. Communities are different, neighborhoods are different, individuals are different. And if we keep saying this one person represents this whole group, we're missing out on everything about the complexity and beauty of these spaces. So that would be what I would say and didn't answer your question, sorry.
That's totally okay. Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful. And yeah, thank you for framing it like that as well. I think we're ready for our Q&A. Kevin, if you could kick.
Yep, great. So hello, everyone. You're not seeing me, but hopefully you can hear my voice. We had a question for you, Deanna, and I'm going to read it, that you mentioned the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and there was a suggestion that funding from that source is problematic for some Native American communities, because it requires that land be designated in perpetuity, which takes it out of tribal control and reduces sovereignty of Native communities. And yet these are the same communities that have the actual greatest need for open space funding, because they don't have usable parks, playgrounds, and nor a tax base to fund them. So that's the background. And the question is this: is there anything in the new legislation, or could there potentially be, that could address an issue like this?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm gonna be honest and say I don't know. I have not had this issue raised to me before, but it's, I don't know, but I think it's obviously a very valid question. I have not read the legislation with that challenge in mind. And I would say that if you want to follow up with me directly, I would be happy to look at the legislation beforehand and have a conversation about it, and let you know what I think after having read it, with that lens, whether there might be opportunities there.
I'm gonna take Susie Moser's question. First of all, Susie, I'm sorry I totally butchered your name in the chat because of autocorrect, so I really apologize for that. Susie's question is for Baja. She asks, so picking up on Baja's notion of the broken governance systems, am I hearing finally a shift away from mainstreaming climate change into everything we have always done? If so, hallelujah, but I am not sure you meant that. Can you reflect out loud a bit about what it means to do resilience work when the systems through which we have tried this so far are so deeply flawed? Thanks all, great conversation, go women.
I think probably all the panelists have a really good answer to this, so I'm not going to take up the whole space. What I will say is, yes, that's exactly what I'm getting at, Susie, is stop trying to mainstream into the systems that we know have not been working and have not been serving the community for decades. I even think the metrics in which we establish success and the idea of greenhouse gas emissions being what we need to commit to as the only thing of success in the climate space is fatally flawed. The thing I would say is we have to dismantle the system. We have to acknowledge the systems are broken, both institutions and government. We have to be aware of our own place in maintaining those systems. And then we have to start dismantling those systems and breaking them down. And there's going to be so many different ways that has to happen that I would take up too much time. But I do think that focusing on innovation and new approaches, we can't rest on what we know. What we know has not been working. And so let's get out of these restrictions and these silos and these spaces we give ourselves and instead be open to something completely different and new. And I think we're seeing that movement on the ground of get rid of the police departments, try something different. Why not? Because we have not been doing a good job.
Jen, can I add to that as well? I am, again, nodding to everything that Baja said, but I think there are two very specific things that we need to dismantle. And it's notions around speed and scale, which really drive us away from communities that haven't had the investment to be at the start line. To take in large sums of federal money, for example, or private investment. So we get a lot of magical thinking and romantic notions about public-private partnerships, and we often advise against them in low-income and minority communities because the priorities get trampled in service of how you fit into the funnel of those big funds and those big programs. And so I would love to see more investment on pre-development in communities that can actually do participatory budgeting, priority surfacing, and have that set of priorities ready. And in terms of scale, I want to get away from building the mega project to aggregating large portfolios of small projects to be more appropriate to the need. And both of those things we are terrible at. And I would challenge anyone from the impact investing community to look hard at yourselves because finance drives us in the opposite direction in both of these things.
Great. I think we still have some time for maybe another question.
Yeah.
Kevin, would you like to ask your question, or I can?
I would like to ask my question, but it's a different one than the one I sent to you, Jen.
Okay.
As somebody who lives in higher education at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, do all of you or any of you have reflections on the role of higher education in preparing professionals for this new kind of work that you're imagining and that I think is so essential? It would be of great value to the faculty and those of us on the staff at Yale.
Kevin, the answer is yes. I'm just trying to organize my thoughts, which is why I'm staring blankly into the Zoom screen. I think there's an the fact that the Yale program has produced folks like Jen and Malika is a credit to how you all are taking a systems approach. So first of all, higher ed isn't doing this all wrong. I do think the jobs of the future are not going to look like the jobs of the past. And if they do, we failed. And so Jen and I have had this conversation before. I think we need to be preparing resilience professionals for a career of lily pads and being able to collect successful examples of what's worked and how they've contributed. And this betrays my training as an architect, where you build a portfolio of work to show what you've done very specifically. I think that's really hard in resilience, especially when others throw around the terms mainstreaming and co-benefits very loosely. It's difficult to know what success looks like when success is something that hasn't happened. And so, Kevin, I would love to see professors and administrators institution-wide give students a way to plug in and show when they are doing big systems change, what they've actually contributed, how that should be reflected on a resume and a CV so that it's understood and not just binned into political campaign language, and allow them to collect across a career a portfolio of how they have actually built resilience for the communities they serve. And I think that will take a multidisciplinary approach, and I would love to see that happen in fields from architecture to engineering to poli-sci.
And I would follow up on the same things I said about working with the community, is treating our students like humans too, and recognizing there's lots of factors and needs and approaches. I was surprised when I went back to graduate school at the fact that we still do presentations with PowerPoints as a way of learning, without recognizing that so many people learn in different ways, and that we just really need to focus a little bit more on action-based, getting involved. I do think there's a lot of folks who don't understand how politics works, the complexity of government, and the, I will say, complete broken nature of the way decisions are made. That has to be a reality of not coming out of school thinking, I'm going to design this amazing solution, or I'm going to go in and change every policy and code, and why haven't people done this yet? You know, I'm going to daylight every stream. There have to be realities associated with each one of them. And I think it's getting students involved and having them see those things, understanding the way the system's been broken, understanding the decades of how the system has perpetuated that. And then also treating them as humans who can only do so much, so that they're not coming out overwhelmed and just paralyzed with how big the problems are, because each little step makes a difference, but we have to make sure that we're recognizing that and valuing it and celebrating it, because each of us can get massively overwhelmed in this space.
I don't have anything to add that wouldn't be duplicative, and I want to end it on Baja because that was such a thoughtful answer.
As a recent grad, I can very much appreciate what you both just said, and I'm going to reevaluate how I put things in my portfolio now. So I shouldn't write going to daylight every stream on my resume anymore.
Oh no, Jen, you should totally do that. We need it.
Thank you again. We are out of time, but a huge thank you again to Rachel at ASAP and Beth as well, and to Kevin at FES for helping to make space for this dialogue, and to all of you at home for tuning in, thank you. And of course, thank you to our fantastic panelists, Deanna, Baja, Shalini, for co-creating this really important discussion today. Take care, everybody, and be well.
Thank you all.